Welcome back to The Thinking Mind, podcast all about psychiatry, psychology, self-development, and related topics. Today, I'm sharing a live recording of a talk I recently gave at the MRC Lab of Medical Sciences at Imperial College, London. And this talk is all about personality, and personality is a topic I'm absolutely fascinated by. So in today's talk, I'll discuss what personality is, how we define it, where we go wrong when we talk about personality culturally, why it's useful to have an understanding of the human personality both for yourself, other people, and your relationships with them. And specifically, I go into the 5-factor model or Big Five model of personality, and I discuss why I focus on that model and not, say, the Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram, or dare I say astrology as a way of understanding ourselves. I discuss a little about how personality can influence things like our political opinions, our interests, our hobbies, our passions, and how understanding personality can help us when we're choosing our career, making decisions about dating and relationships, and how we can use an understanding of personality for quote-unquote personal growth. The full video of this talk will also be on YouTube very shortly, so as soon as that's up, I will be adding the link to the description of this podcast. If it's not there now, it will probably be there in the next few days. And my special thanks goes to James Elliott, who works at the MRCA Institute, who invited me, who is a listener and friend of the podcast. Before we get into the talk, just a couple of announcements. Firstly, my TEDx talk that I gave at London Business School back in April is now out. This is a talk based on my recent Guardian article about why we shouldn't always be trusting our instincts. Even though we very much live in a trust your gut, trust your instinct, go with your intuition kind of culture, that's not always the best decision. So if you're interested in that, the link is also in the description. Doing this talk, I should say, was super intense, but an extremely rewarding experience for me. I want to personally thank everyone involved at the London Business School. It was essentially such an amazing opportunity to work on writing, public speaking, and I had a lot of fun. Incidentally, if you'd like me to talk for your team, company, or organization, or on your podcast, you can email me at alexcurmitherapy@gmail.com and put speaking inquiry in the subject line. Our second announcement is we're extremely excited to announce the Thinking Mind blog coming next week to Substack. For a long time, the team and I have been wanting to experiment with different ways of communicating interesting ideas around mental health and psychology and all the stuff covered by the podcast. This blog is headed up by Dr. Rosie Blunstone. She's a psychiatry and psychotherapy registrar who has been working with the podcast behind the scenes for a few years now. This is going to be a monthly newsletter companion to the podcast. It will feature different discussion points, talking about news in mental health, new mental health technologies, things along those lines. Also reviews of recent podcast episodes, news about upcoming episodes, and the book club, where we discuss different books on psychology and mental health, a bit about news and politics as it relates to mental health. And on the first edition of the newsletter, which is coming out next week, we'll also be discussing a bit about the origin story of the podcast and how we originally started putting this together back in 2019. This will be out next week, so we'll be putting the Substack link in the description of all our podcasts from next week, and we're super excited to share ideas with you in different formats. And now here's my personality talk recorded live at Imperial College. As always, thanks for listening. A bit about my background. So I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I'm training as a psychotherapist. So I've been training as a psychotherapist for 4 years. I've also more recently started doing something I call behavior change coaching. So helping people to change their behavior in some way to improve their quality of life. I've been kind of obsessed with psychology for about 10 years. I'm very fascinated by why people do the things that they do, how people get in their own way, and how we can work around that. So that's the background from which I'm coming at this issue. Why is personality important? Personality is a roadmap. A particular model of personality is a roadmap a person can start to use for, as I said before, a bit of self-understanding and understanding other people. The strange thing you learn when you start training as a psychotherapist is that we're often an enigma to ourselves. We can feel on the one hand that we're quite self-aware, and yes, we seem to know what our patterns are, and yet we can run into trouble all the time. We can make the same mistakes over and over again, have the same kind of conflicts with people over and over again, run up against these issues. And perhaps we might see the same in our personal lives and the people that are close to us, that they seem to be running headfirst into the same particular wall over and over again in their lives. So in my view, understanding personality is finally getting a map or an instruction manual for ourselves that can help us to decode ourselves a little bit. Really interesting question. What is personality? We're all fascinated by it. We all have some idea of what a personality is. We use the word personality a lot. But how can we define personality? I think one problem that comes up in our culture is we tend to talk about personality in a very moralistic sense. Does someone have a good personality or a bad one? I think one of the takeaways of this talk would be to think about personality less from a value moralistic point of view and more from a pragmatic point of view, by which I mean, are my personality traits working for me in this situation or not? Is it an effective tool? And this theme of personality traits being a tool is going to come up a few times. And similarly for other people, like, is their personality working for them in this moment or not? The way I define personality is the set of traits that tend to be relatively stable across life. And each trait is really a pattern of thinking, feeling, behaving, importantly, a way of seeing the world. And each trait is trying to help us solve some sort of problem, usually in the way we relate to ourselves, or we relate to the world, or we relate to other people. So if you take extroversion, for instance, if you're really extroverted, that's going to be a way of seeing the world as a social landscape primarily. It's going to be a way of thinking, behaving. I love socializing. I want to go out and socialize as much as possible. That's what brings me joy. So it's a set of traits that help us solve problems related to ourselves, other people, the world, and relatively stable across life. Which model are we going to use? As I said, we're going to concentrate on the 5-factor model for the simple reason that it's the most evidence-based and it seems to have the most predictive power. I'm super interested in personality models in general. I've looked into the Myers-Briggs, I've looked into the Enneagram. I think they're all fascinating. I think they're all fascinating to help stimulate thought. Of course, we even look to the stars and we look at the month we're born to see if that can influence our personality. That's called astrology. I don't put much faith in astrology because it's not that evidence-based. But then again, I am a Sagittarius, so do keep that in mind. We're going to talk about the 5-factor model today. The cool thing about the 5-factor model, and you guys will appreciate this from a scientific perspective, is that in contrast to a lot of other models of personality, where you come up with a hypothesis and you set out to prove it, I think people work like this. Let's find the data that supports that. The 5-factor model is different. The 5-factor model just asks people a bunch of questions, like hundreds and thousands of questions about personality, and then they study that to see what theory emerges from that data, which is really what you want in science, right? You want to get a bunch of data and see what kind of hypothesis might emerge, rather than coming up with your own hypothesis and trying to find data which fits that, which, as we know, can be a huge problem in science. So the 5-factor model, I mean, its origins can trace back as early as the 1930s and 40s, when people started to think about personality traits, took off more in the 60s and 70s, really became formalized and really well studied cross-culturally in the 90s. How they came up with it, as I said, asked loads of people lots and lots of personality questions. Do you like to go out? How do you like to spend your time? Are you emotionally sensitive? Do you cry easily? Do you like to work hard? All those kinds of questions. And then based on that, they got a huge amount of data from that, and they ran something called a factor analysis, which helps us to understand which answers correlate with which other answers. So they found is people that said, oh, I like to go out a lot, that answer might correlate with, I like to spend time around people. Or similarly, I often feel worried, tends to correlate with I often feel sad, for example. So what they found doing the factor analysis on this data is that 5 factors, 5 spectrums emerged. And I really want to emphasize that they're dimensional spectrums. They're not boxes. A lot of personality models, the problem with them is they tend to put people in boxes.
Whereas here we're thinking about people as always falling on a single point along 5 different spectrums. And you can imagine how much individuality that actually produces if you're at a single point across 5 separate spectrums. And these are the spectrums. We have openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and probably the worst named one, neuroticism, which I prefer to call emotional sensitivity. And we're going to go through each of these in turn and what they mean. So the first one we're going to discuss is openness, or openness to experience. What you'll find is each of these broad traits subdivides into subtraits, and there are probably more subtraits under that. But openness subdivides into aesthetics and ideas. So people who are high in openness, they'll tend to be interested in things like art, innovation, trying something in a new way. They love ideas, poetry, philosophy, music. They're the kind of people that aren't going to listen to the music that's just on the radio. They're going to create their own Spotify playlist because they want to listen to their music. Conversely, people who are low in openness, they tend to like sameness. They're not so addicted to novelty. They prefer boundaries. They prefer things to be put in boxes. They're not so interested in abstract ideas. If they're watching a film, they're much more likely to watch the summer blockbuster at Cineworld. They're not going to go to the Curzon art house cinema to watch the Hungarian film in black and white subtitles. And with each trait here, I'm putting example questions. So these are the actual questions that you might find on a Big 5 personality test, where the ones at the top would be ones that confirm or suggest someone being high in openness, like I have a rich vocabulary, I have a vivid imagination, I have excellent ideas. The ones at the bottom are reversed, so people that answer in the affirmative or would say very often or very much, they would tend to be low in openness. They say things like, I like things the way they are, not the way they could be. I'm not super interested in abstract ideas. I prefer non-fiction. Fiction just seems like a waste of time. I just don't get it. That's openness. As I said, subdivides the aesthetics. So people are really interested in visual beauty, and ideas. So people are really interested in thinking about things in a new way, like a philosopher, for example. The next one is conscientiousness. And that subdivides into industriousness and orderliness. So industriousness is that propensity to work hard, to prioritize the future over the present, because that's really what work is. Work is substituting the present for the future. And orderliness. How much do I like things in a particular order? And you can imagine that at a physical level. So at a physical level, someone high in orderliness is going to have their cupboard, everything arranged perfectly, the mugs, and then the big glasses, and then the small glasses. But it's also orderliness in the sense of ideas. They want ideas to be in a very particular order. They might want their countries to be in a very particular order. We're going to talk about that a bit later. Examples of conscientiousness. I'm always prepared. So I've thought about the future already. I sacrificed some of the present before so I can think about the future. I pay attention to the fine details. I get chores done right away. I follow a schedule. People who are high in conscientiousness tend to be very predictable and reliable. As a result, conscientiousness is one of the strongest predictors of life success. Generally speaking, IQ is the highest predictor, and conscientiousness is number 2. There are some studies which have even put conscientiousness above IQ in terms of a predictor of success. People who are low in conscientiousness, they don't tend to like order so much. They prefer to live in the moment, again, not sacrificing the present, but actually enjoying and appreciating the present. I often forget to put things back in their proper place. I tend to shirk my duties. I prefer things a little bit messy. Thirdly, we're going to talk about extroversion, which I think is probably one of the most well-known personality traits. Extroversion is really about how you relate to the social world. So it subdivides into assertiveness, how much you assert yourself and express yourself, and enthusiasm, which is like positive emotion. So people who are higher in extroversion tend to be higher in positive emotion generally. People who are extroverted, they tend to be good at making a large amount of social connections very rapidly, but they might not be so deep. So an introvert is the opposite. It's not that an introvert doesn't like social connections at all, but they prefer to have very few social connections and then go very deep on them, and also of course, to spend time alone. Whereas the extrovert is that person in the party who's speaking to everyone and making friends with everyone. And they're so good at socializing because they can leave a conversation gracefully. You barely know they've left the conversation and they're talking to the next person. They're called social butterflies often. People who are not so extroverted, they're not going to talk as much. They prefer to keep in the background. They don't like to draw attention to themselves so much. Agreeableness, this one comes up a lot in psychotherapy. A lot of times people go to psychotherapy because they're actually too agreeable and they need to learn to be more disagreeable. And I'll talk about that more later. If you're really high in agreeableness, you're very interested in people, you're going to prioritize social harmony over yourself. I prefer if everyone just gets along rather than I getting what I want necessarily. They're very good at picking up what other people are feeling and sympathizing. They're probably going to have trouble standing up for themselves. And they'll sacrifice themselves for other people all the time. Conversely, people who are very disagreeable, low in agreeableness, they really good at prioritizing themselves or maybe the people close to them as opposed to everyone else. Disagreeable people are a bit more us or them. They tend to prioritize rationality often over social harmony. They can be too blunt. Agreeableness subdivides into politeness and compassion. So you can imagine very highly agreeable people, very, very polite, and more focused on what's good for the other person, often what's good for the underdog. Disagreeable to people tend to be the opposite. Emotional sensitivity, a very important trait, of course, to understand if you work in healthcare, but especially in mental health care. Being higher in emotional sensitivity is a risk factor for something like depression, anxiety, other kinds of mental health problems. That subdivides into volatility, i.e., how rapidly your emotions change in a given situation, and withdrawal, how likely you are to withdraw from a situation due to perceived threat or danger. People who are higher in emotional sensitivity tend to get stressed out more easily, they tend to worry, but they are very good at picking up at other people's emotions, similar to highly agreeable people, might get upset more easily. Whereas if you're low in emotional sensitivity, you tend to be the opposite. You can take a lot of emotional punishment. Really, emotional sensitivity is a measure of like how much negative emotion do I experience per unit of stress. So you can imagine two people might lose their job, say, a very stressful life event. One person might get more stressed out than the other one. People who are very, very low in emotional sensitivity, they're good at like politics, for instance, where you have to take constant harassment and barrage of pressure, or they tend to be good in military or police or special ops or stuff like that. People who are high in emotional sensitivity, they tend to be good at working with people in some capacity. They tend to make good therapists, healthcare workers, any situation where you need to pick up on the emotions of other people. Something I'd really love to emphasize now that we have an idea of the traits is that the traits aren't just about behavior. And I think normally when we think of personality, we think of behavior, what someone does. Crucially, personality is the lens that you have on the world. So your personality is your particular lens. So what do I mean by this? If there's just one thing you take away from this talk, take away this. There's a huge amount of data you could be taking in from the environment at any given moment. You're actually only taking in a tiny, tiny amount of it. There's too much for your brain to process all at once. So your brain has many mechanisms to figure out what actually is relevant to me. And that happens based on various things. But one of the things that it's based on is your personality. Your personality will affect what you perceive as important and relevant in the environment and what you don't. So if you're, for example, highly extroverted, you see the world as a social landscape, an opportunity to socialize with people. If you're on an internet page and there's an advert for a party, you're much more likely to perceive that as opposed to just block it out unconsciously. If you're very highly conscientious and you're interested in finance and you read a newspaper, all the stories about the economy or job opportunities or that kind of thing is going to be really important to you. On the other hand, if you're very agreeable, all the stories about damage to the environment or the underdog or the person that's in trouble, though the human interest stories, those are going to be the stories that are going to be relevant. The rest are unconsciously filtered out. Very important to understand this. We're walking around with our unique lens, which means we all see the world slightly differently. And this problem is extremely amplified by the technology we now have access to, because we all know we now have one of these in our pocket. And what is this doing? Essentially, it's amplifying that lens, because TikTok knows to show me certain videos that it doesn't show you, based on your interest, based on your personality. So at least in the past, if we had a situation where we were at least huddled around the same radio or the same television, at least the base information was the same. And yeah, we might emphasize or de-emphasize different parts of that. Now it's gotten 100 times worse, because we're actually taking very different information based on our preferences. And there's this constant dynamic interaction between our preferences and what we're being shown. It's not just what we see, it's also what we care about, of course. And that's, what we perceive, and our values are very intimately linked, as I alluded to before. It's going to be what motivates us, what we think life is about, what we think is worth pursuing, but also what we think is worth stomping out or eradicating, what we don't like about people or the world. Personality influences all of this. As a result of the past two ideas I've shown, you can imagine that personality is a huge cause of conflict. And I think people don't take personality difference into account enough when they do have conflict. I think we take it into account sometimes, but do we really take into account, okay, this person has a unique lens on the world and therefore they're picking up different information than me, so we're working on different facts and that's why we're coming into conflict? No, we don't do that, I think, most of the time. We usually think that person's wrong and I am right and they're wrong. Yeah, perfect. Sometimes that's the case. A lot of times it's this much more sophisticated and subtle psychological process. So the next time that you're arguing with your uncle at dinner about politics, and we will talk about politics in a second, just keep that in mind. Like, they're seeing the world slightly differently. They're picking up information that I'm not. I'm picking up information that they're not. We functionally kind of live in slightly different worlds and slightly different media landscapes as well. As I said before, this is a dimensional model, not a categorical model, which I think is a huge strength, because it means that we're taking into account everyone's real uniqueness and individuality in a way that a categorical model can't. So you see this with Myers-Briggs, I believe, is categorical. The Enneagram is categorical. And again, while I think they're interesting to read about and can really stimulate thought, they always get into trouble because they have to make these big categories, and then to explain all the variation, they have to create this very elaborate, often confusing system of subcategories. Like you'd be your main Enneagram type, and then there's a bunch of subtypes, and your wing, and this and that. And the Big Five elegantly disposes of that problem. Another point I would really love to emphasize is that there are no good and bad personality traits. Every personality trait is a strength and a weakness at the same time. I actually believe that strengths and weaknesses tend to be joined at the hip. We think of them as separate, but actually I think they're very connected to each other. Whether or not a personality trait is a strength or a weakness largely depends on the match between that trait and the situational context. So if you're very low in emotional sensitivity and you're very high in disagreeableness, that will make you a very conflict-prone person who can do a lot of conflict, maybe even violent. That's terrible in the boardroom in 2025, although it might have some advantages, but mostly it's terrible. If you're a Viking in the Middle Ages, it's extremely advantageous. And that is part of the problem we encounter with personalities. It shines or doesn't shine based a lot on the environment and the context that person is in. One interesting question, obviously, is nature or nurture. I think working in a place of science, I'm sure you guys will have very educated opinions on this. People get stirred up by this question, of course, because a lot of people really don't like to feel there is any kind of genetic influence or biological determination of how we think or feel or behave. It's a very uncomfortable idea for a lot of people for good reasons. But I mean, I wonder what you guys think. So do you guys have maybe anyone who thinks that is mostly nature, could you raise your hands? So very few of you. Do any of you think mostly that it's nurture? Yeah, and that does tend to be the more popular opinion. As I said, we prefer to think of it as nurture, right? I guess by nurture we mean our parents, perhaps. So what the science would suggest is, on average, it's about 50-50. Yeah, it depends on the trait. So some traits seem to be more genetically determined than others, but then different studies will come up with different results. Seems to average out at around 50-50. This doesn't mean, of course, that we're biologically determined or purely genetically determined. It just means there's a strong genetic influence. And of course, if 50% is biologically or genetically determined, that leaves a huge 50% range for environment, which means environment meaning parents, siblings, school, culture, religion, community, work, has an enormous effect. Politics, there's a lot of political conflict at the moment. One of the cool things about this model is you can predict someone's political opinion based on the traits that they have. This was made famous by the company Cambridge Analytica, which, as far as I know, allegedly, illegally, or at the very least unethically harvested a lot of data from Facebook and fed that into a personality model to target people with particular political adverts dependent on their personalities. In terms of the big five, what we have is the higher you are in openness, the more likely you are to be left-leaning politically, which makes sense because openness means you like innovation and you like to do things a little bit differently to the way they've always been done. You tend to be a bit more skeptical of tradition, that kind of thing. You're less fussy about everything being tightly bordered, and that works at the idea level, but even the geographic level, like maybe we don't need super tight borders, like literally, maybe more in favor of immigration and that kind of thing. If you're very low in openness, you tend to be more conservative. You prepare things in boxes, you prefer things to be a very particular way. You're really a big fan of tradition. You're conservative. It's like, let's do what has always worked before. Let's not try anything new. Innovation can be very dangerous to someone that's low in openness. Similarly, if you're very high in agreeableness, you tend to be more left-leaning. You can understand that. Agreeable people tend to be more compassionate, tend to favor the underdog, tend to prioritize other people over themselves. So if you're interested in minority ethnic populations or poor people or homeless people, the underdogs of society tend to be higher in agreeableness. Whereas disagreeable people, they tend to care about sort of themselves and their immediate community a bit more. And as I said, they tend to prioritize something like rationality over politeness. So they're the kind of person that they prefer to make sure everyone, when we're splitting the bill at the restaurant, that everyone pays their exact amount. Even if it's a very small difference, whether it's the agreeable person, it's actually so split the bill. Split the bill, it's fine. We don't have to fight over this. How does personality tend to change across the lifespan? So in general, one of the things that defines personality is stability. You can say, I have a particular personality because you can see how I am today and I want to be roughly the same tomorrow. I'm probably roughly the same next week. So personality is defined by stability, barring, very exceptional life events, trauma, etc. But there are changes that tend to occur across time. So as people get older, they tend to get higher in conscientiousness and they tend to get lower in emotional sensitivity. And that makes sense because I think the more life you live, the more you realize actually sacrificing the present for a future is probably a good idea. I didn't really realize that when I was 10 or 20 or 30. But by the time I'm like 40, 50, 60, I get it. Like saving some money now will really come in handy in 10 years' time. And similarly with emotional sensitivity, I do think in general, most people tend to create an environment around them that supports them. So they tend to get into a stable relationship, some kind of stable job and income, stable living situation. And all of those tend to ameliorate our sensitivities a bit and we feel a bit more secure. I think this is backed up by some other studies about like happiness across the lifespan, where actually people are often happiest towards the end of their life. I think that's for a few different reasons. Like they also have gotten out of the way some of their life's biggest challenges, but also because I think when people get towards the end of their life, they've built a system which really works well for them and helps to keep them stable. What are the main limitations of the five-factor model? So I'd want to emphasize every model is going to have limitations. Every model is just a model. And I would prefer that you take away from this talk the notion that I should really understand personality in general and think about it and use it to design my life, rather than taking away from this talk, the five-factor model is everything. I think it's the best model, most evidence-based, most predictive value, but it's got some limitations. I don't think it explains everything about human behavior. In fact, there are newer versions of the five-factor model that have been developed or are being developed that have one new personality trait, which I mentioned. Cross-culturally, it has been studied cross-culturally, and largely these traits have shown to be valid across different cultures, but there's still likely to be exceptions. There's still likely to be some traits which might exist, for example, in a country like China, which are just not likely to be prevalent in a Western country. So every model is just a model, and I would want to emphasize that. Human behavior is simply too complex. The other thing is that the five-factor model is good at it's a descriptive model. It's not a causative model. So the five-factor model is not saying anything about what causes you to have the personality that you have particularly, but it's a really good way of giving you a snapshot of where you are right now and what are you like right now. And the last limitation is that it doesn't take into account situational changes, how someone might be, for example, very conscientious in one situation, but then not super conscientious in another situation. Because of course in life, we are constantly dealing with and navigating different situations, and the five-factor model probably doesn't take that adequately into account. What I want you to think about when you're by yourself, if you so choose, is think, where do you lie on these five spectrums? And I'll give you some tests you could take online. Importantly, how do these traits influence your view of the world and your little micro world? What strengths and weaknesses does your personality structure give you? How does it affect your particular choice of work? How does it affect your politics? How does it affect your lifestyle choices and all the different choices you might make in your personal life? Next, we're going to talk about personality disorder. So where do things tend to go wrong at the personality level? Personality disorder is very, very stigmatized. It's stigmatized generally in the culture. And I'm sad to say that it's also stigmatized within mental health settings as well. So often, I've obviously worked in a few different mental health settings, and you'll often find people saying things like, oh, I prefer working with bipolar, say, or schizophrenia rather than personality disorder. I think this is for a few reasons. If someone is, for example, presenting with a manic episode, we don't give them a huge amount of responsibility for that. We tend to feel, they have an illness of some kind, and this illness is causing a manic episode. Whereas I think when people have personality problems, we give them a lot of moral responsibility for their behavior. And I think this is a very human thing for us to do. And I think, as I said before, because we don't really choose our personalities. Personality is determined by genetics and by environment, but we don't choose either our genetics or our environment. We can kind of start to choose our environment once we're like 21. We can start to select our environment a bit, but we don't choose our personalities by and large. So I think the same amount of compassion and understanding is warranted for people with personality problems as it is for someone with a different kind of mental health condition like bipolar or schizophrenia, but still incredibly stigmatized. And it's worth saying people with personality difficulties often evoke very strong feelings in the people they're working with, which we call countertransference, very strong countertransferential reactions like anger or sadness or things like that. This is how we classically have clustered personality problems in psychiatry. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of this through the big five. So sometimes people might meet the criteria for something like paranoid personality, for example. People with a paranoid personality tend to be very mistrustful, defensive, isolated. So you can think in terms of the big five, they would probably be quite introverted. They would probably be quite emotionally sensitive. Those are the big ones, and mistrustful. Someone with a schizoid personality, they tend to be very isolated, but without the paranoia. So they tend to be very solitary. It's very unlikely that they're going to form a lot of relationships outside of their family relationships. And so someone with a schizoid personality, you think, okay, they're going to be very, very high in introversion, probably not as high as sensitivity as someone with a paranoid personality. And then schizotypal personality is someone who, again, very isolated, but they believe in all sorts of ideas which are considered outside of the mainstream. So they might think a lot about UFOs and the paranormal. They might spend their weekends ghost hunting. They might believe in the power of crystal healing and things like that. That's very typical of a schizotypal. So what you're seeing there probably is, again, a high amount of introversion, but then probably really high openness to experience. Like, I'm open to everything. I'm very open-minded. Cluster B, where we're thinking about antisocial, which is another word for like psychopathy, and antisocial, they're synonymous. Borderline, or more recently called emotionally unstable personality, histrionic, narcissistic. Looking at someone with antisocial personality, they're very likely to be very low in emotional sensitivity, very, very low in agreeableness, and very low in conscientiousness. So someone who's a bit more antisocial, they don't really care about rules. They don't invest in rules. They don't invest in rules for themselves or for other people. That's the low in conscientiousness part. They don't really care about other people. They have a very, what characterizes antisocial personality is a lack of empathy. So they tend to be lower in agreeableness and low in emotional sensitivity, which predisposes for all this very difficult behaviors someone with antisocial personality might get up to, like getting into fights or burglarizing someone's house. If you or I were to try and break into someone's house, that might be a bit anxiety provoking. For someone with antisocial personality, that's not such a big deal. If you think of something like emotionally unstable personality disorder, you're going to have someone who's probably quite high in emotional sensitivity. Agreeableness, extroversion, conscientiousness, openness, they can really vary, but it's the sensitivity, emotional sensitivity, which really characterizes something like emotionally unstable personality disorder. Histrionic, what's really emphasized there is the extroversion. People with a histrionic personality tend to be quite dramatic, and they tend to be quite attention-seeking. I think narcissism deserves its own lecture. Narcissism is talked about so much nowadays. It's actually quite hard to distinguish narcissism from antisocial in terms of the big five. But just broadly, psychologically, what you have with narcissism is that entitlement, that feeling of specialness, that feeling of status and reward, which is importantly not necessarily deserved or not necessarily concordant with reality. But generally speaking, in your typical, let's say, grandiose, Trumpian, Muskian narcissism, what you would see is low emotional, well, at times quite high emotional sensitivity, disagreeableness, a high extroversion, and then conscientiousness can vary and openness can vary. So there's a number of other personality disorders I could talk about, avoidant, dependent, obsessive compulsive. Thinking about obsessive compulsive, for instance, that's someone who's going to be really, really high in orderliness, needs things to be a very certain way, and if they're not, that's very anxiety provoking. Avoidant, of course, again, emotional sensitivity is going to be very high, probably extroversion is going to be very low. Dependent, agreeableness is going to be very high. When you get really high in agreeableness, what you get is someone who's very willing to sacrifice themselves so much for another person that they, in fact, try and merge with other people. They really see relationships as them being the powerless one, and they try to form relationships with people who they feel are more powerful and can take care of them, hence dependence. How does personality disorder typically present? Actually, one thing I want to emphasize is when you're going about your life, like be at work or personal life, one really good principle is extremes tend to not be such a good idea. So when someone's extremely high in a particular trait, they tend to lack the complementary traits, which could really balance it out. So if they're really high in openness, which means they're really into new ideas, it could be really helpful for them to develop a little bit of skepticism. So extremes are generally a bad idea. And also what I would want to get you thinking about in your personal life is dangerous combinations. What kind of combinations can form themselves to cause trouble? So just as a simple example, someone who's really high in extroversion, but really low in emotional sensitivity, they're going to be very talented socially, but they're not going to be necessarily so good at picking up on other people's emotions and caring about them. So I just want to get you thinking about this idea of dangerous combinations. How does something like personality disorder typically present? They're usually extremes of one trait or another, usually extremes of a few traits, and so they tend to present with extremes of behavior. If you think of something like emotionally unstable personality, that often presents with things like self-harm and other, like impulsive behaviors, things along suicidality, things like that. Something like narcissism may present very obliquely. So a narcissist, because of the nature of narcissism, they often don't really think something is wrong with them. They usually think something is wrong with someone else. But a narcissist might present when their life falls apart as a result of their narcissism. So a narcissism will often present later, let's say 40s or 50s, when they're divorced, or they don't necessarily have a very good relationship with their children, or they just got fired for bad behavior. And then maybe they become depressed as a result of that. And as a therapist, you're seeing them for depression, you think. And then as you get to know them and you get to work together, you actually realize underlying this depression is a series of problems fueled by narcissism. The medical industry has tried its best to treat personality with medications. And like, can we use medications in the same way we use medications with bipolar disorder or depression? And kind of predictably, it hasn't really worked. I think using medication, as blunt an instrument as psychiatric medication to treat something as complicated as personality is kind of a fool's errand, and we know it doesn't really work. The most you can do with medication is perhaps you can, for example, tamper down someone's emotional sensitivity, because psychiatric medications can help tamper down someone's emotions. People often describe that as emotional blunting. Sometimes people find that useful and it helps them get through life. And sometimes they actually find it decreases the quality of their life quite a lot. So in general, medications aren't the way to help someone with their personality. It's generally the remit of something like psychotherapy. And why is that? Similar to what I want to talk about in part 3 of this talk, psychotherapy helps to develop self-awareness. And then from that place of self-awareness to gradually grow, change, cultivate traits which might complement or balance out your existing traits and help you to negotiate better with yourself, relate better to yourself, relate better to the world, relate better to the people around you. So psychotherapy really works at the personality level. And a lot of like prominent psychotherapists like Carl Rogers, for instance, who founded person-centered therapy, really talked about personality change as one of the explicit goals of psychotherapy. This is another activity you can do at home if you like. Think about some of your trickiest clients, or dare I say colleagues, or people in your life, and have a think, what is their personality structure like broadly, like roughly speaking? How do you think these traits contribute to their behavior? And crucially, what is the personality dynamic between you and them? How do you relate to each other at a personality level? Because as I said before, that's obviously going to take a lot of ownership of yourself, and hopefully the first activity will help. But it emphasizes that it's often about this dynamic. What are the differences? What you'll find, for example, in every romantic relationship is there's a clean one and a messy one. There is an extrovert and an introvert. And the introvert in one relationship, they might end that relationship and date someone else. And perhaps when they date someone else, they're the extrovert in that relationship. Because it's all relative. It depends where someone sits in relation to the person they're with. And you might think, how much, once you understand a little bit about their personality, this difficult person or people in your life, how would you approach them differently? If you understand their scaffolding, if you understand like how they see the world, if you understand what they care about, if you understand what motivates them, how might that subtly or not so subtly change the way you approach them? So the last part of this talk is really the practical part. What do you do with all this information that I've given you? How do you, once you know a little bit about your personality, how does that help you to structure your life? As I said earlier, self-awareness is the first step. Once you have a little bit of a map of self-understanding of what motivates you, of what you care about, that can inform a whole bunch of decisions that you make. If you think about work, my general advice when it comes to personality and work is you don't want to choose a kind of work where you're always swimming upstream to your personality. You're going to make life very, very difficult for yourself. So to give you an example, if you're really high in openness, you probably shouldn't be an accountant. Accountants don't get rewarded for creativity. Quite the opposite. Accountants tend to go to prison when they're too creative. Accountants are, if you want to be an accountant, you should probably be very high in conscientiousness because you need to be very reliable. You need to be very detail oriented, probably more introverted, I imagine, because a lot of accountants might do a lot of work solo. If you're very high in extroversion, you could be something like an events planner where you're constantly interacting with people, where your job is really to help people to have a good time. If you're introverted, you'd probably make a good therapist because introverts are good at having very, very deep one-on-one interactions and then thinking about those interactions quietly by themselves. As opposed to the event planner, who's going to be making lots of different social connections all the time, but not necessarily connections that are deep. I think often people get really, really successful when they find a line of work which helps them, which complements and amplifies their existing strengths, rather than trying to do something completely different, something counterintuitive. It is exhausting to do something that's counter to your personality all the time, as I'm sure you guys have learned from one point or another in your life. Now, that being said, I do think having found a niche that complements your strength, I think there is something to be said for starting to broaden your personality, which I will talk about. And that can make you from successful to hyper successful, because now you're not only in a niche which complements your strengths, but you're also developing a very dynamic skill set, a dynamic way of seeing the world and solves problems. And that can make you really unique in whatever form of work you're doing. I think understanding personality is crucial for team building. I mean, I think we have such different personalities as a species because it helped us to become the dominant species on the planet. So if you read a book like Yuval Noah Harari's *Sapiens*, his main thesis is our ability to collaborate in large numbers is what helped us to become number one. But in contrast to other species, let's say a species of ants, for instance, where, again, they're collaborating in large numbers, but ants are all roughly the same and doing the same thing, whereas human beings, we specialize. So if you just think about the team that you exist in and the organization that you exist in, you're all doing different things and you all excel at slightly different things, and that makes you much stronger collaborating. And going back to the conflict idea, I think it's worth remembering human beings of all different types exist for a reason. I think all these different personality types evolves because each kind of personality, each trait is a way of solving a particular problem. And life is constantly throwing these very unpredictable problems at us. So if you take away, for example, all the people who love innovation and you get a new problem coming at you, you're not going to have those really innovative people who are going to help you solve that problem. Conversely, if you take away all the people who love tradition and you're just innovative people, you're never going to get the chance to build a tradition of, we know these practices work. We know career works, so we know marriage works, so these very traditional things. And so there isn't a lot of reliability there isn't a lot of solidity there to your culture. So the point here is that we need people of all kinds of personalities, true, like real diversity. I think you can think about your team building in terms of the different roles that someone might serve in your team. So if you're working in a company that needs to acquire clients and then retain clients, you might have some people who are really good at acquiring clients and some people that are really good at retaining them. So you can imagine an extrovert, again, is going to be really good at acquiring clients because they're good at forming those relationships initially. But for the retention, you probably want someone really high in conscientiousness because they're reliable. When it comes to retaining, people love predictability and reliability. The really cool thing about knowing personality is it helps you form win-win relationships. And it's my belief that win-win relationships are really the holy grail when it comes to friendship, business, marriage. This is the concept of win-win. I don't know if it started with, but I definitely encountered it in the classic self-help book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You can build a win-win relationship much more easily if you understand personality, because a win is different from everyone. A win is different for me and for you, dependent on my personality, what motivates me, again, what I care about. If you understand personality, you can much faster than the average person understand what is a win for them and then give it to them explicitly. And that helps to form a much more sustainable relationship. And of course, you can think, what is a win for me? What do I really care about? And that just helps you to build a happier life. Cultivating hobbies and passions. The one thing that I think is that really that felt sense of fascination and engagement and that feeling of I can do this forever, I can get paid to do this, I'm happy to do this for as long as I can. That's a sense that we can feel somewhere in our bodies or even our guts, that sense of fascination. And of course, it's informed by our personalities. So when it comes to cultivating hobbies and passions, which actually, strangely, a lot of people have trouble with nowadays, my advice is to experiment with doing lots of different kinds of things and just look out for that feeling of fascination. But through no choice of your own, one kind of activity is going to make you feel really passionate and engaged, and another one, because of your personality, is going to give you no interest at all. And I think in an era where I think we hyper-consume, again, media, it can be very easy to not experiment with different activities. But that's what I really encourage. Experiment, look out for that felt sense of fascination. That's going to be a window into what could be a hobby for you or a passion, potentially what could be a career as well. And some people make their passion their career. And of course, that's going to give you a window into your personality. What do you care about? Dating and relationships. So this is the big one. This is why you have personality quizzes on the cover of a lot of magazines. I am curious, in terms of dating and relationship, how many of you guys think you need to find a personality that's very, very similar to you? Very few people. And how many people think you need to find a personality that's very different to you? Okay, a few more people. So it's kind of similar to nature and nurture. I definitely think we are more attracted to the idea of we need to find someone different. Opposites attract, right? Opposites attract. I think the evidence would largely suggest we need to find people who are kind of similar, not the same, because the chance of finding someone the same is extraordinarily low. But in general, what makes a compatible relationship, and of course not a compatible weekend fling, but a compatible relationship that lasts for years and decades, is largely similarity. Because similar personalities means you care about the same things, you see the world roughly the same way, and it means you can negotiate with each other a lot more easily. So that's what the evidence says, and I think that's largely true. I do think we should make room for interesting polarities in personality, and I do think they tend to happen, even if two people are quite similar. As I said before, you still find someone who's like the messier one, someone who's the more extroverted one, someone who's perhaps a little bit more industrious or orderly. And I think it's probably okay to have a big difference on maybe one trait, maybe two traits. If you're really different on like 4 traits, it's going to be again, you might have an amazing weekend fling. I don't think that's going to translate into a very sustainable relationship. That's a little bit how to think about dating. Conflict, I think we've talked about enough. A lot of the people I see in psychotherapy where they struggle with is relationship with self. How do I relate to myself? I think part of the process of coming to terms with your personality is developing self-acceptance. And I don't mean self-acceptance in a kind of Instagram hallmark kind of way, just like love myself forever. but it's more just coming to terms with who you are and coming to terms with your nature and kind of having a baseline level of equanimity with that. And then from that place, if you want to be different in some way, you can do that. But it's actually very hard to change or grow if you don't at first accept yourself. The very concrete example of this is if you recognize in yourself, oh, I have a tendency to eat too much and gain weight, and I don't love going to the gym or exercising, it's very hard to change any of that if you don't accept it to the degree that it causes a lot of shame and embarrassment and you resist it all the time. If you can come to terms with that, like, yeah, actually, I do eat too much if the opportunity presents itself. I don't love to exercise. I can accept that. Then from that place, okay, now I can start to build systems. I can build a system that helps me because I have this tendency. How can I help myself? I might throw all the junk food out of the house, for example. Or I might make exercising easy by going to a dance class, which I love because I love dancing rather than lifting weights, something like that. So personality can be very useful to cultivate a more harmonious relationship with self. And then one way you can actually start to make changes. And this brings us to the very interesting question of, can you expand your personality range? And I think that's probably the healthier way of putting it, because some people might say, how do I transform my personality? And I think maybe we'll put aside transformation right now, even though it's probably a better title for like a self-help seminar. But how can you expand your personality range? How can you expand your personality toolkit, if you like? I think there is a pessimistic case and the optimistic case. The pessimistic case is really from the literature, which says actually most people tend to be quite stable in terms of their personality across the lifespan. So if you look at large groups of people, they tend to remain roughly the same, minus those particular trends I mentioned. The optimistic case is we see this all the time in psychotherapy, that of course people do change. People are able to develop self-awareness, and from that place, they can do something different. That doesn't mean it's not difficult. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what personality change or expansion can look like. But I think we overestimate the degree to which it's not possible at all. And I think that's largely because we never really talk about personality or personality change that much in the mainstream culture. So I think the best way to frame it is difficult but achievable, especially if you have a plan. So what might be the plan if you want to change your personality? I think one thing is probably to recognize that you're not actually going to totally change. So if you're an introvert, like it's very common, for instance, in psychotherapy, for an introvert to want to become more extroverted. And an introvert is probably not going to change night and day. They're not eventually going to become an extrovert. The way I put it is an introvert can learn the toolkit of extroversion. I consider myself a natural introvert. And through years, I've cultivated the toolkit of extroversion that I can do public speaking and things like that. That doesn't mean I don't need a lot of time alone to recharge, because I do, because I'm an introvert. But it does mean I can do a lot of the things that extroverts do. And I think the same case can be made for any personality trait, and sometimes in ways which aren't so obvious. So someone might be really high in conscientiousness, for instance, which might be really useful because they're so industrious and orderly and reliable, but they might not be a lot of fun at a party. They might have a lot of trouble appreciating the present. They might work really hard to afford an amazing holiday, but then once they're on the beach, they can't enjoy it because they're sending emails. So as I said before, there is no good personality trait. There's just a trait that's well adapted to its context and not. If you wanted to expand your personality in some way, so let's say you are an introvert and you want to become an extrovert, what I would advise you to do is study the micro habits of an extrovert. So really look at not at the big picture level, it's a very granular level. What does an extrovert do? What do they do when they're going shopping? Oh, they talk to the people in front of them in the queue, or they might share a few extra words with the cashier. Or if they're at a party, they're going to start 3 or 4 different conversations, and they're not super shy about leaving a conversation. So you study those micro behaviors, and then you slowly but consistently start to enact them in your own life. So you might go to a party and say, normally I'd speak to one person in the corner for 4 hours. That's my introverted way of dealing with the party. Today I'm going to challenge myself to speak to 2 or 3 people. So it doesn't have to be this huge, rapid, overnight change, but small, consistent change over months and years can do the trick. And you might say, how the hell do you sustain this for months or years? Which is a really good question. And the answer is, if you really actually want it badly enough and you start to do it, you're going to eventually start to get the rewards of that behavior. So, for example, if you're really low in conscientiousness and therefore your financial situation isn't so good, and you start to be more conscientious with money and you study the behaviors of your conscientious friends, and then in a year's time, you're like, oh, wow, I have like £1,000 more in my bank account than I normally would have, then that becomes its own reward. And you start to realize, oh, this trait isn't just boring. This trait actually has a reason behind it. And then it becomes a self-reinforcing engine and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's how it tends to work. A lot of hard work at the beginning. But as you start to develop the rewards of that trait, then you're like, wow, this is really useful. And then I think, again, this is the optimistic case. You can keep going and going and keep developing and developing a personality trait to quite a high level. Doesn't mean you're a completely different person, but it means you have a way more dynamic way of interacting with the world and with your life. Part of this is also developing your own unique offering. So you might know the word unique selling point, USP. A company tends to have a USP, or a product tends to have a USP. This might seem a bit vulgar, but you as a person, you have your own USP, and that's based on your personality. So if you get to know your personality, you get to know the very, very, very particular way you see the world that's very different from the person next to you, and what you have to offer because of those combinations, and it's all about the combinations that someone else doesn't. And that, if you choose to discover it, cultivate it, grow it, can mean you can contribute something very real and very unique. That could be in your job, that could be in your personal life, really in any area of life. The last activity, again, to reflect on by yourself, you can think, how does my personality affect my life? What are the strengths? So where is it serving me? Where is it working really well? But then conversely, where is it getting in my way? How does it contribute to the way I might approach a situation that's not getting a very good outcome? Crucially, and maybe this might be one of the most difficult questions to reflect on, how well matched is my personality to my circumstance? How well matches my personality to my work or my career or my relationships or where I live, all those various things? Which trait or traits could I theoretically cultivate? Which trait would it be really, really handy for me to have? Like maybe I am an accountant and I'm really introverted, but every so often I have to do a presentation and I know I'm not going to get a promotion unless I get good at presenting. So maybe I need to develop that extroverted toolkit. How would you go about doing this? So if you had to make a plan to start developing that trait, how would you start to do this? Shameless plug, this is my podcast, The Thinking Mind. Every week we release an episode about either psychiatric medicine, psychology, mental health, self-development, the kind of things I've talked about today. We're on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Here are a couple of tests. So this test has a small fee. I think it's like $5, but I would actually recommend doing a test with a fee because they tend to be better tests and give you a better report. I'm not affiliated with either of these tests, but that one has a small fee. That one is free, and it's on the website of a man called Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio is one of the most successful investors of all time. He has a company, I believe, called Bridgewater Associates, and he, in terms of his hiring process and team building process, is a big believer in the Big Five. And so he wrote about that in his book Principles, which is a really good book. And he made a personality test that's not the Big Five exactly, but it's based on the Big Five. And it's quite good for identifying like career preference and things like that. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you very much for listening.